let's create your very first unit test using Jest. So what you'll need to follow along is terminal. You should already have that, hopefully. I'm using a Mac, so my commands may be different than yours. You should also ideally be using VS Code, and that's kind of it. Hopefully you also have access to NPM as a package manager. All this is super simple stuff to get started with, and the instructions for how to download all that stuff will be in the show notes below, so you can follow along. And you can do this on your own as well. So I'm going to get started and show you how to write your first test. I own a bootcamp, Parsity.io, right? Check it out for sure. Anyway, we teach unit testing, but before I own this bootcamp, I'm still a software engineer, by the way. I manage a team. And one of my big initiatives when I first joined my company was to start unit testing. I noticed that we had 0 unit tests. I'd come from some other companies where we did a lot of unit testing, and I noticed that bootcamps are sorely lacking in this department, which blows my mind because it's become kind of this expectation that you just essentially know how to write unit tests when you join a company. Is it kind of silly? Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of like expecting people to know how to use Git and GitHub, but most boot camps teach that, yet they don't teach how to write unit tests. So what are unit tests, first of all? They're a way for us to test that our code achieves the functionality we expect it to through some other code. So basically, we write code to test the code that we just wrote. Why on earth would you want to do that? You might think, well, can I just click around and see if stuff is working? And yeah, absolutely, you could. But what if you want to test a bunch of scenarios? What if you want to test something mission critical that is time intensive? You might want to offload that onto a computer that can do that kind of task repeatedly a lot, make sure that your code doesn't break as a result. Imagine you write a function like we're going to do soon, and imagine you write a function and it's supposed to, I don't know, sum up 2 numbers or do some complex calculation. And you put it out there and you've tested a few scenarios. Somebody else goes in there. They don't know how it works quite right. They add some functionality to it. It breaks. Guess what? Now you have a broken app and you think, wait, why didn't you test this? They didn't know what to test. It could have been documented somewhere. It's a lot easier if you have a set of tests that have to pass. That way you can be very confident that the code you've written doesn't break stuff. Okay, without further ado, hopefully I've sold you on unit testing, but even if I haven't, who cares? Because you're going to come across them, so you should. So what we're going to do is make a new project and make dir, and we're going to have this be called testing test test. Why not? You can name yours whatever you want. I'm going to cd into test test. Make this a little bigger so hopefully you can see if you got bad eyesight. npm init-y. I'm going to initialize a new npm project here, using init-y to give me all the generic default scaffolding I want. This part, not so important. It's okay if you don't quite get this. NPM is the node package manager. We're going to use it to install libraries from around the NPM registry. The registry is a big service, bunch of libraries out there in the cloud that do a lot of stuff that we like. So we can take libraries from other people and use them directly in our code base. In this example, we're going to use Jest. Jest is a delightful JavaScript testing framework, which focuses on simplicity. It is really ubiquitous. Everybody's using Jest. I like it. You can use vtest. You can use whatever. We're going to use Jest. Honestly, the thing I want you to get out of this is like the mindset for testing, not necessarily like the exact syntax for writing tests. Like you can learn JavaScript, or you could learn Python, or you could learn Ruby. What it boils down to is the concepts are essentially the same between a lot of these languages. We're writing code, and when you think about testing in that same way, you kind of think, okay, what is the point of the test? How am I going to write it becomes an implementation detail, meaning not so important as the idea of like, why are you writing the test? What should you be testing? Kind of just how to get started with testing. So the framework in this case, not important, but if you're going to choose one and you're a JavaScript developer, just choose freaking Jest, my friend. We're going to do npm install Jest. We're going to npm install Jest. By the way, if you wanted to like do this here, totally good way to start. Read the documents, RTFM, read the motherfucking manual. What the hell? Why does everybody want to watch a video? I mean, except for like this video right here that you're kind of watching. Anyway, we've installed it. Cool. Now let's write some code by using Vim. Just kidding. We're going to use VS Code. So let's go to VS Code and open up this project. Ignore all the stuff here. We got test test. Come on, test test. Come here. Get over here. Okay. Come on, little test. Yeah, I trust the author, sure. So I'm using VS Code, and hopefully you are too, because why the hell wouldn't you? I'm going to use the integrated terminal by pressing Control backtick. If you don't know how to find that, figure it out. And so cool. We have our package.json. We have Jest as a dependency. And now let's actually write some code. So let's write some really basic stuff. Let's make a new file. It can be called main.js, right? And in this file, let's make a function. So we're going to make a function that does something fairly simple. Let's make this function like determine whether a word is a palindrome or not. So const is palindrome equals some string, and the string is going to return some stuff here. Okay, cool. So this I'm using GitHub Copilot. It wrote some code for me. And do I suggest you using GitHub Copilot if you're just starting out to code? Probably not. Could I have figured this out on my own? Yeah, I mean, I really hope so, right? I've been writing code for quite a while, so if you have not, don't worry. I would fully expect that this may take you longer to do. So let's review the logic here. We have a function called isPalindrome. It takes in a string as an argument, and then it checks whether or not it is a palindrome. It says it initializes a variable, reverse string, and it says string.split. So it splits it, makes it into array. It then reverses that array, and then it joins it back to make it a string. So if we have something like, taco cat, right? Taco cat is a palindrome. Bob cat is not a palindrome. Thanks, GitHub Copilot. And one way you could test it is just doing this, right? You might say, well, I could just test that doing this. This is a trivial example, my friend. Now, don't get too wrapped up in like, well, this is something you don't need to write a test for this. And you're right. You probably shouldn't need to write a test for this. Ideally, you write a test when the logic is 1, hard to reproduce, 2, complex, 3, to avoid or supplement documentation. So maybe you have something that's like very business specific, like your business says, well, we consider palindromes anything that has this number of characters and spaces made by some business legal dude up top, and you have some weird code, and you're thinking, is anybody going to remember all this stuff? Do I have to write like a laundry list of comments? Maybe it would be better if I wrote a freaking test, which we're going to do right here. So let's make a test for this. So the way you make a test, some common conventions for doing that, create a new file. We're going to call this main.test.js. If you call it .test or .spec, the Jest library is smart enough to pick that up and says, wait a second, you want me to test or to run my library, my functionality over that particular file. If I named it main potato, that wouldn't work. Also, that would just be weird. Why would you ever do that? Don't do that. So the way you start off with the test is you describe the logic. In this case, we might describe is palindrome. And then we would have some tests inside of here. It says it. So the top part, describes the function, right? The it blocks in here will describe scenarios which we want to test. So this first one, we say it, and within parentheses, we say it should do something. We write the test. In fact, if we were going to use test-driven development, we would have written this test before we even wrote the function. And we'd say what we expect it to do. So what do we expect a palindrome to do? I got another test that I think is going to fail. It should ignore casing of the palindrome. And how can we test that? We say expect the function is palindrome taco cat to be true. Okay, what else can we do? That seems sufficient for now, right? We have a few test cases. And you might be thinking, where does it come from? Where does describe come from? How are you just using these? Well, the Jest library exposes these functions, these methods, to the global namespace, to the global scope. So you can just quickly use it without having to import a bunch of stuff. But in this case, if you wanted to, I believe you could import describe and expect from Jest globals. But they're globals, so you shouldn't need to. You might need to, though, so this may not work. I'm doing this in real time, by the way, with the power of GitHub Copilot. This becomes really simple to do, and this is a great way to get started. And I would say if you're going to do a take-home challenge, like for some company that gives us awful take-home challenges, with like write a app that does X, Y, and Z, and you have 4 hours to do it, but really the whole weekend, and then you turn it in, and they give you no feedback, and they tell you to kick rocks because they don't want to hire you, and you wonder why. I don't know why. Don't do those tests. If you can avoid those, avoid them. But I know you can't when you're starting off. So if you can't, at least do this. Write a test, add some documentation. You're going to get a hell of a lot further than 99% of people that don't do it. Quick side note, I had a mentee of mine that did exactly that. got hired, but when he got to the interview, they said, the reason why we invited you on was because you were one of the few people that wrote tests. I think he was the only person that wrote a test in the, the group of people they were trying out. So write tests. Anyway, let's do this. npm, or no, say Jest. So Jest should run the test here. Let's see, package.json. We'll need to add a script test. So what we need to do here is change this to Jest. Script test. This makes a command that is available now in the what's it called in the terminal. So if we do npm test, look at that. It will run the test. Oh, and look, we have some issues here. So one is we didn't actually import the function we were supposed to use. So let's import that function. So first, let's export const is palindrome, and then we should import it here. We need to make sure we can actually use it. So import is palindrome import. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Let's try this again. And we see blah, 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 blah. Oops, let's make these require. So let's remove that. This is, we are using a different syntax, const, blah, 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 equals require. And I think this should work. Let's see, unexpected token export, and we can change that to module.exports equals is palindrome. Okay, now all's right with the world. Let's get rid of that, and let's see it again. Ooh, look at that. So it says 2 passed, 1 failed. Which one do you think failed? This is the power of the testing. So now we have a test, really easy to set up, by the way, super simple to set up. We did a couple things. We added it to package.json. We're using the library as a dependency, meaning we are downloading that library. We added a script that allowed us to run npm test in the terminal. And finally, we are testing the code which we wrote. And we've added some test cases using the syntax which Jest wants. Say describe the function. Every it block is a self-contained unit of logic that's going to test some assumption. The first part is just a string that says, hey, here's what we expect. We expect, I don't know, something. The second part is where we actually add in code the expectation. We expect is palindrome taco cat to be what? To be true or false, right? So we run the function with an argument, and we say, okay, here's the function we run, and we expect something to happen. Now, what we expect will change depending on what we are testing. So how can we change this? We can string.split.reverse. We could do string dot to lowercase equals reverse dot string dot to lowercase. Now will our tests work? Let's see. To be true, and it should ignore the casing and blah, 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 blah. Return string. Oh, how about we just do this? String dot to lowercase. Huh, that'd be a lot easier, wouldn't it? And now all the tests pass. So let's write one more function here. Let's do something a little bit different. This one was pretty simple because we expected it to be true or to be false. Let's do something like const sum equals AB, and we'll return A plus B. Again, it's incredibly trivial. Why would we ever do this? Because it's a good way to test things out, to get started. When you're just starting out, you don't always have to be practical. It's just a matter of like learning how to do it. So how would you start this one? Well, you could describe sum, right? And then you could have, so here's a perfect example of a test. Again, using Copilot because it's a lot easier to see me just fly through this, but you should ideally not be because it'll help you understand. And I would expect, like, let's just write this over. What do we expect? We expect the sum of 2 and 2 to be 4. And I also like to check the opposite. I would change this to be 5. Let's just see what happens. Let's run our test. There we go. And what do we see here? If we move up here, oh, sum is not defined. So first of all, let's add it in here. And let's see this. Okay, look at that. It says received 4. It expected 5 because we told it to expect 5, but it received 4, obviously, because 2 plus 2 is 4. Let's change it to 4. and then go in here and do that. Bingo, bango. This is your first introduction, your first test you've written. Completely useless test, but that's okay because when you first start off, you're going to write useless stuff. Try incorporating this in your code at your work, on the side projects you're doing. If you're using something like React, you'll check out React testing library. It essentially follows this same pattern. You are testing an input versus an output and making sure that they are the same. This way, this palindrome one is actually a decent one because maybe there's a case where you're like, I don't care about the casing of this. We can even try all sorts of stuff. We can try talk, cat with a capital A, and we should expect that to still work. In this case, that way, if somebody comes along and uses the code, they have some documentation that tells them, here's what I expect to happen, right? So don't mess with this code. And if you do mess with it, if somebody's like, oh, this is silly, why do they put lowercase? I'll put uppercase, and then, and I'll ship this out to production. Then they run the test and they say, oh no. Now they have some guidelines, some guidance on what is and what is not expected. Hopefully this was helpful for you. Hopefully you can get yours running and write some much more complex tests. There's all sorts of things to learn about testing, like mocking things, like working with asynchronous code, working with third-party libraries. In fact, I wrote a whole course on it that I won't even get into here. But if you want to learn this stuff, you want to become a software engineer, you want to work with me and learn the code and all that good stuff, join me at parsity.io. And if you want my unit testing course only, just hit me up. You can find me at brian@parsity.io, and I can give you access to some free stuff and some not so free stuff. See you around.